Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I have another fabulous guest with me today. Her name is Yvonne Caputo. She has been a storyteller all her life. As a teacher, psychotherapist, corporate trainer, and consultant, she has used stories to widen the eyes of her students. She is also the author of 2 books titled Flying with Dad, which was published in 2019, and Dying with Dad, which was published in 2022. Yvonne has her master's degree in both education and psychology. She loves history and traveling. She lives in Southeastern Pennsylvania with her husband, Kirk, and her dog, Ellie, who happens to be a Berne-doodle. I've never heard of that before. So Yvonne, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And we have a lot of other things in common. We're both from the same part of the country originally, and we both love animals, especially dogs.
Especially dogs.
So tell us your story. I find it fascinating that you've been a storyteller all your life. And that actually started at a young age because you were kind of an introverted child. Is that correct?
Very much so. I lived in a neighborhood. There were 40 guys, and they were rough and tumble and playing war and all this kind of stuff. And that was just not anything I was interested in. So much of my time I spent alone with my nose in a book. And having my nose in a book was something that was very much fostered by my mother. I loved a story. I loved a really good story. So being lost in a book was where you would find me.
And so then how did that shape you, growing up? I mean, when you're really small, and you're reading a lot, you don't really develop some of the social skills with your peers as easily as if you were out playing with them, even rough and tumble, no matter what it was.
It really did impact because I didn't grow into a personality, I think, until I started teaching. And then being shy and a little bawkward just didn't work. I mean, you had to be in front of a group of people, and you had to be lively. You had to be engaging. I can also say that Sister Mary Carmel really helped me along, because in freshman year in high school, she said, I want you to do debate. And we used to compete on Sundays against other Catholic high schools in our area. And after the freshman year, don't know where I got the chutzpah, but I went to Sister and I said, I don't like debate. And she said, I don't care what you stay in, but I want you to stay in forensics. And forensics was the speaking arm of competition. So she said, what do you want to choose? Which category would you like to do? And I said, drama. So for 3 or 4 years in high school, I would memorize a long soliloquy, and out I would go on these competitions, and started to do fairly well. Sometimes would come in first, sometimes would come in second. So that led to doing theater in college, which I also really loved. But I found when I started to teach that those were the skills that I relied on. And it's where I learned to tell a story. Because the books and the workbook pages, that wasn't where the kids were engaged. The kids were engaged when they were in a story. And it wasn't just me reading a story, but me telling them a story. So I really learned the craft by being an elementary school teacher.
Wow. So as you were developing this skill and fine-tuning it as a teacher, did you ever imagine that storytelling skill would eventually translate into writing a book or 2?
Not at all. What happened was in 2008, Dad was living alone. My mom had passed away in 2002. And Dad lived in Meadville, and I live in Southeastern Pennsylvania. It's a 6.5-hour drive. So The thing that would happen would be the Sunday evening phone calls. And we had made arrangements for Dad to get in-home care. And so we didn't have to worry about that part of it. His groceries were taken care of. His doctor's appointments were all taken care of. So on a Sunday night, when I called him, it was generally, okay, how was dialysis? Any blood work that you had to have done? How were your doctor's appointments? How are the things at the house? And then the conversation would lag. I'm not a sports person. I don't like football. I don't like baseball. My brother and sister are really into it. So they would be able to engage with Dad, but Dad and I would struggle with what to say. But one night in January, he opened up and told me a quirky, funny, off-the-wall story about making an emergency landing with their third engine out in a B-24 in 1945.
Wow.
Funny and quirky. Now, the landing they made safely. Okay, so they got down. And they were billeted above a bistro. Not a bad place to be. The bistro owner comes to them and says, do you have cigarettes? Well, of course they had them. They were a part of the C rations. If they were downed, it was their way out because they could barter them. And the owner said, do you have cigarettes? And Dad said, yeah. Are you willing to part with them? Dad said, sure. What do we get in reverse? In the middle of the night, they go out in the middle of the countryside in Belgium, go to where there are hay bales, scrape them off the ground, dig, unearth cases of French champagne, put it on the B-24, flew it back to the airbase. Dad goes gets the police, the military police, and says, guard this plane with your life. We've got top secret information. And then once they get a truck, they take half of the champagne to the non-coms and half to the officers club. And the following morning, the colonel, base commander, is really a little miffed at the condition of some of his men. But Dad said all you needed to do was breathe pure oxygen and your head was straight. That's the story. So in the midst of him doing all this, I said, Dad, let me get a pencil and paper. I want to take this out. What the hell do you want to do that for? I said, this is really good. I think that this is something that the family would like to have. The very next phone call, the very next Sunday, I don't know where it came from. It spilled out of me just somehow. Dad, if you're willing, start at the beginning. And he did. And story after story after story came rolling off his tongue. And somewhere maybe along the fourth chapter, because I started writing. I started writing, meaning that this was going to be for the family.
Right.
About the fourth chapter, I said, got something here. I have something here that deserves a wider audience. So I continued to work on the book. And my father saw the first draft. It was his Christmas present before he died.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, what a wonderful gift. What did he say? What was his reaction? And before you even tell me that, did he know that you were turning it into a book? I mean, he obviously knew that you were recording the stories or writing them down, but did he know it was going to be a book?
I told him. Okay. I said, this is just too good. There's so much richness in here that there are people beyond just the family members that really need to know this. In December, at Christmas time of 2009, we went back to visit my dad in the hospital. And we spent 3 or 4 days and did the things, cleaning the house and making sure he had groceries and all the kinds of things for him to be released when he was ready. And my husband and his brother went to get the car all gassed up so that we could make the 6.5 hour journey home.
Mhm.
Just before I left the room, I had given him the book. And I said to him, I said, I want you to know how proud I am of you.
Oh.
And he said, what for? And I first, for your service during World War II. And he said, no, honey, I'm proud of you. You wrote the book.
Wow.
You wrote the book. So that's what I went home on, was that. So yes, he knew it was a book and he knew that it was finished. And he literally got a chance to see it. He didn't get a chance to read the whole thing.
I can't help but laugh when you talk about it. What would you do that for? Or, because that's exactly how my father was, just so gruff and, what's the point of that? Or why would you do that? But yeah, I think that they didn't understand how much their stories really did mean to us. I mean, when my dad would talk about growing up in Czechoslovakia, and my grandmother too, they would talk and they would share some stories, but when we were really little, it just didn't seem to impact us as much as when we got to be older and then adults of, wow, that was an awful lot to go through. And even having that quirky sense of humor and telling that story about the champagne, I just absolutely love that. There were some stories that my father-in-law would tell. He was a Marine. My dad was, in the Navy. And when the first time they met, I mean, they spent hours just sharing barbs and stories and kind of digs at each other for their different branch of service. I think people really need to hear those stories.
They did. And I wasn't writing about Eisenhower. I wasn't writing about Franklin Roosevelt. I was writing about an ordinary GI that never would have had to have gone.
Right.
My dad had a presidential deferment that would have kept him in the States for the entire length of the war because he repaired airplanes.
Oh.
He got out of high school. He finished high school in 1939, deep in the middle of the Depression. Any reasonable job was going to go to a man who had a family. The support from my father came from his two sisters, his two Italian sisters that worked in a coat factory. They were seamstresses. So one of the sisters gets engaged. And here's dad living with one sister, only one income that's not nearly going to cover rent and food and all that kind of stuff. So he was really pushed to go out and get something. So he went to the welfare office. And at that time, the youth administration program was up and running. It was an executive order by FDR. Dad said they had a list of things that he could train to do. He took his finger down the list, boom, hit airplane repair and said, that's it. That's what I want to do. And he said to me, that's because he'd been building airplane models all of his life. And now he was going to get to work on the real thing.
Wow.
So he's got this presidential deferment because the planes that, in Dad's words, young, new learning pilots would bust up, would come into Dad's depot for Dad to fix. Well, fast forward, he meets General Hap Arnold, who is the general who is over the entire Air Force. And General Arnold called him over to his office. And he said to Dad, where did you get that piece of equipment? It was a Cincinnati press brake. It was something that folded metal. And Dad said, well, I knew where one was. I requisitioned it, sir. And General Arnold said, well, it was meant to go to Macon, Georgia, and you're going with it. So Dad is transferred to Macon, Georgia. An AT-6 comes in to his depot. It's a training plane.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a wing. So Dad did what he would normally do. He would call around to all the depots in the United States. Something would get shipped to him.
Mm-hmm.
He would fix it and off it would go.
Mm-hmm.
No wing, nowhere. So Dad went to his supervisor and said, do you have the blueprints? And the supervisor said, sure. What are you going to do with them? Dad said, well, I'll build it. He's 20 years old. He's 19 or 20 years old. He builds the wing, attaches it to the plane. The pilot who's going to test this plane knows, comes over to my father and said, is it going to fly?
Right.
Dad said, yeah. You're sure it's going to fly? Yeah. You're positive it's going to fly? Yeah. Well, good, son, get in, because if it goes down, you're going down with it. So Dad gets in. It's a two-seater. Dad gets into the plane. And his exact words to me, Cheryl, were, I didn't want to fix him. I wanted to fly him.
Mm.
So when that flight was over, it took him 4 months to petition to get out of his position to become
Wow.
an Air Force cadet.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, the spirit, he has the spirit of a warrior and just knew what he wanted to do and did whatever it took to get it. So then did he join the Air Force? I mean, what was the training like to, get into the Air Force and qualify to be a pilot?
He was never a pilot. He could have been a pilot.
Mm.
But a segue, he met and married my mom
Mm.
and decided that it would take him longer to learn to be a pilot when he could up his pay grade by being a navigator. And he also enjoyed the science rather of being a navigator.
Mm-hmm.
So he petitioned to get out. He went to Miami Beach,
Mm-hmm.
basic training.
Mm-hmm.
Camp Miami Beach, the best one in the entire United States. Okay. Nothing's going on. There are no people coming to Miami. We're in the middle of a war. So the Army Air Corps took it over.
Mm-hmm.
From Miami Beach, he goes to Meadville and he meets this sweet little blonde. They knew each other for 6 weeks. 6 months later, they were married.
Wow.
And the marriage lasted 58 years.
Wow. That's incredible. I got to go back to your dad attaching the wing to the plane because I'm wondering how in the heck he did that. How do you attach a wing to a plane? Did he tell you that? I mean, did he weld it? Did he scotch tape it? Did he, nail? How?
I would have to look closely to the pictures, but my assumption is that it's riveted.
Okay.
But like I said, I would have to look very, very closely at the pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he did say to the supervisor, he said, a blueprint is a blueprint. Mm-hmm. If I can build something for a model, I can build something for the real thing. Mm-hmm. And for you and I, 17 and a half feet long. That's how long the wing is for the AT-6.
Wow. Okay. Now, and you mentioned pictures and looking at the picture, and that just makes me wonder, do you include any of the photos that you have in the book?
Some of them. Most of the pictures that I have in the book are of us as a family, mm-hmm. not necessarily any of the other kind of aircraft pictures. And that's because the more pictures you do, the more expensive the book is.
Yes, I know. Yeah, including pictures is very expensive for printing. So the book went out in 2019. You're in the process of writing this book. Did it take you on an emotional roller coaster? I mean, your relationship with your father had already changed because of that one story that he told you. But then as you're writing this, were you actually in the story, just experiencing what your dad was experiencing and then meeting your mom and all those things? I mean, did it become even more personal on a visceral level?
No. And here's why. Actually, you are asking a question that a book club asked me.
Mm.
When I was writing all of these stories, what's the sentence structure? Am I creating a picture? Am I telling it in a way that people will get to the emotions without necessarily, dragging, right? I was so involved in the writing of the book. When it really hit me was when I got the author's proof and I sat down and I read it. Then I went, holy mackerel, what did I do? And of course, the tears would come. And of course, my chest got heavy because the outcome of the book isn't just that my dad's story gets told, but that third section of the book is how the writing of the book brought me the father I always wanted, and how he got a daughter that he didn't know he had. On our conversations after the writing of the book and during the writing of the book, Dad opened up about nightmares. Dad opened up about a flashback. Dad opened up and we had conversations about, he said to me, Yvonne, I'm so tired, I want to go. And I would say, tell me about it, tell me more. And he would say things like, I can't do what I want. I'm not allowed to drive my car. I have to count on people to get me groceries and things. I just want to go. And I miss your mother. So those were the kind of really intimate conversations that we were having. Because he had gotten to the point that I had wanted, he trusted me. He just trusted me.
When you had that sense of, oh my, what have I done? Was it almost a little bit of, I call it writer's regret, when you realize that story is out there for the entire world to see, especially the part where, you're talking about your relationship. I mean, it makes you so vulnerable, and putting it out to the world is quite terrifying, I think.
I say when I think about the writing of the book that my career choices really laid the groundwork for me to do this so late in life. Telling a story to children, you've got to tell it in a way that it registers emotionally with them. Because if it doesn't register emotionally, it's not a story.
Right.
It's a regurgitation of facts. All right. So then I took a group of kids to England, and we lived in a youth hostel for a whole week. So here I've got kids 24/7, and all of their issues started to come out, and I felt clueless to help them. So I went back and got the second master's degree in clinical psychology. Met and married Kirk late in life. Couldn't find a teaching job, ended up working in employee assistance work, doing training. So here I am using the stories again and sharing in training groups my vulnerability by talking about some of those emotions, or talking about some of the places that I've been, being able to talk to somebody about what it was like to lose a brother, a 20 brother. And then, working in human resources, where I had the lovely opportunity to sit and talk with the elderly about what their lives meant. So all along the way, I'm building this, I would say, skill set that when it came time, the writing came. I had the experience that I needed. And you're right about it being vulnerable, but one of the things that has come back to me from people is, I so understand my family now, given what you've told me about yours. I had the same kind of family that you did. You know, I really resonated with that distance that you had between you and your dad. So, it was difficult, but in the end, again, when I read it through for the first time, my hope was that people were going to be as touched by it as I thought they might be.
Well, I wouldn't understand how they couldn't be. I mean, even just listening to the story, and I haven't read the book yet, but it's already just made an impact on me, and I know the listeners too. And I just want to circle back to the late in life phrase, or so late in life, because, of course, doing the podcast, I've talked to a lot of people who have written books at this age and this stage in life. Let's just call it the third, okay? Because it's almost like, not that they have this burning desire, but we have so many stories deep inside of us. And I think that when we get to a certain age, there's that need to share them, not only for, our descendants, but to share with the world, because I think our stories really connect us a lot more closely than people think they do. And we're living in a time where we're all so divided and all on our own path, that when we have the opportunity to share stories, that we realize how much we really have in common.
Absolutely. My father's bomb group was the 467th. They were stationed at a little village called Rackheath outside of Norwich, England. And the 467th created an association that continues to this day. All of the members of the board and most of the members are second generations. Okay. Our reunion this year was in Norwich, England. Those who came on this reunion got to walk in the paths that their fathers or grandfathers or uncles had walked.
Wow.
And we never had a political discussion. We never had a religious discussion. But there was such a unity of spirit within those of us who were traveling together. And what that spirit came from was our love and admiration for those men who were our family members. We were just all talking about that. One of the men on the trip, big guy, really big, solidly built, could have been a linebacker for, a major football team. But to see his eyes well up in tears, to have him come over to me and express the same emotional resonance to the place that we were standing on, you can't beat it.
There are no words to describe it.
There are no words to describe it.
So I just want to segue or interject for the listeners right now. Listening to this powerful story, for those of you who are entering, certain phase of life, how important it is to listen to your parents, listen to, your elders, and record their stories, write them down. It's so important to be able to have that legacy, to be able to pass on, not only to your descendants, but to other people. It's just so important. My mom was, she was really something else. She was very, very much, interested in family history and stuff. And she wrote not really a book, but she made my uncle, her only brother, and herself, they were writing stories, and she was writing them down, and she would make him tell her stories of what they remembered of their childhood. And then, it was like a blended family. So they went to their 3 older sisters and just said, it was the same thing, write these stories down. And then, of course, the last egg to crack was my father. And she's like, George, you need to share all these stories. I'll write them down. And he wouldn't do it until finally she broke him, and he's okay. So he started telling stories. So they compiled it in a booklet that I have. And a lot of those stories are going to be included in the book that I'm writing on my family history. And I'm talking not just my parents, I'm going back to my grandparents, who I knew all 4 of them. And I also have stories about my great-grandparents. And I wish I could get more. I don't know. I haven't really started the deep research yet, but it's just so amazing to understand what these people went through and how resilient they were and how strong.
One side of my family landed here in the United States in the 1730s.
Oh.
And I was able to weave some of that in to this beginning part of the book. Mm-hmm. Because I really wanted people to have a sense of what it was. And if you know my mother, you need to know my grandmother. Mm-hmm. And if you know my grandmother, you need to know how my grandmother got to be the way she was. Mm-hmm. Then on the other side of the fence, my grandmother and 4 children got on a boat from Naples, Italy, and came in 1921. Dad was born in 1922. Wow. There's no way that you can paint a family picture unless you can go into that. Mm-hmm. My grandmother, an educated woman, was willing to leave the country of origin with 4 little kids, not knowing what in the world she was going to. Nothing. Yes. Now, I am absolutely positive, and the fact that she died when my father was 10, all that makes a difference. Mm-hmm. All that speaks to the man that I came to know as my dad. Mm-hmm. Whoops, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No problem. I'm actually on tenterhooks now, hoping that the dogs don't bark, so a phone ringing is nothing.
Turn on Do Not Disturb. Okay. I love the fact you can edit. So yes, all that stuff really made, I think, an impact on the writing. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only on the writing, but on the reader's side of it, from the reader's aspect, because it just gets so much more deeply intertwined in the story. It makes it so much richer. Mm-hmm. When you can really understand, it's the character, developing character, which is something that, I write nonfiction. So when I go to conferences and they talk about character development, I just kind of start shaking, because it's like, how do you develop a character that you've never met or you don't know?
Well, one of the things that was helpful for me is when it came to all of the things that happened to my parents in Texas. So Dad went from a semester of college education in Meadville to San Antonio, Texas. Then he went to Harlingen, Texas. Then he went to San Marcos, rather. And there's all this history in Texas. So I said to my husband, I'm going to grab a flight and I'm going to go. Because I didn't know from Texas. I'd never been there. I didn't have a sense of it. And I knew that if I was going to structure those chapters, that I would have to be able to do more. So one of the things that I did was I drove from San Antonio to Harlingen, which is right on the coast near the Mexico border. I got a sense of the topography. I got a sense of the distance that Mother had to travel to get to my dad, to get married. They were married in Harlingen. I was able to visit the Heritage Center, and the president of the Heritage Center sent one of the aides over and brought back to me 8.5 by 11 pictures of what the air base looked like during the Second World War.
Wow.
So the travel, the time, the heat. Texas has palm trees. All of that, it may not be blatant, but when you hold on to that stuff, it's where your characterization, it's where your ability to create a scene comes from.
So I guess I'm going to have to go to Czechoslovakia eventually, huh? Or I guess the former Czech. It's the Czech Republic now, right?
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh,
One of my sisters have been there. But yeah. I mean, how do you really write the book unless you've been there?
Yeah, I stood on we had a trip to Italy as well, and I stood on, I'd call it an embankment, but the embankment had a wall, a safety wall, and it was brick and mortar. And you could look out over this wall into the valley and up the other side of these small mountains. My grandfather had to have stood there. He had to have stood there because the village is so small. And the main street, cobblestones and close-set buildings. And in one of the little villages, I was just really enamored at the pastel painting on the buildings themselves. Everyone had a tile roof, but they made a home individual by the color in which it was painted. So all those kinds of things.
So now that was your first book that you were telling us about. Talk about dying with Dad. I mean, that's pretty powerful as well. And what was that like to write that? Because talk about an emotional roller coaster.
It was really the same, that I was trying to create the story in a way that it would resonate with people. I never had an idea for that book. I mean, that one was not on my radar either. But my publisher said to me after we published the first one, I think you've got 3 other books in you, Yvonne. What are they? She said, so think about it. Give me your ideas. We'll talk. So we did. And she said, what about writing about the 5 wishes? Now, for your audience, the 5 wishes is a pamphlet that you can purchase from 5wishes.org for $5. It is a legally known advance directive in 46 states.
Wow.
Now, an advance directive done by an attorney will have, who are you naming to be your healthcare agent? And then what do you want? What do you don't want in terms of sustaining your life? The 5 wishes does that, but it also has, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your children to know? What kind of a funeral do you want? All of these really intimate questions. And it came to me by happenstance because I was working in a retirement community at the time. And one of our senior leaders had gone to a conference and she brought it back and she was so excited about it. You've got to see this. You've just got to see this. So she lent it to me. It laid on my desk for several weeks. And I was finally cleaning up my office on a Friday and saying to myself, you've got to clean off your desk because the housekeepers won't touch it when they come in on the weekend. So underneath all these stacks of papers is the 5 wishes. And I took it out and read it. And I didn't leave my office till very late that night.
Wow.
I was so pulled into how this document was so different from the advance directive I'd already done with Dad. So I said, I need to take this home. I need to do this with Dad. So that's one of the things that sparked my publisher saying, Yvonne, you need to write about the 5 wishes. So what Dying with Dad is all about is my journey from childhood to be comfortable talking to people about death and dying. I don't shy away from it. Residents would come in the retirement community. They'd come into my office. I knew just from the way they were presenting that they wanted to talk about something. It may have taken them a little bit to get into the story, but sooner or later it would be, Yvonne, I want to go. And my response was, tell me. And then a flood of loneliness and longing and tired and pain, it all came bubbling out. And they were just saying, I know that my end is somewhere out there and I'm ready for it. And having those conversations and then going on and having those conversations with Dad, I don't grieve the loss of my father the way I grieve the loss of others, because he went exactly the way he wanted. And he went that way because I could make it happen. So what my publisher was saying is people need to read that. They need to be more open to having these conversations with their loved ones.
So I already told you about my mother, who was a beautiful woman, and she was just as funny as she was beautiful, but she had what she called the death book. She had a spiral notebook, and it was full with everything that she and my dad wanted. Of course, they had their wills and everything done, but this was so specific that it was down to who got what, as far as like, make sure that Cheryl gets the accessories in the bathroom because she's the one that bought them for us. Like, I mean, she had everything down to what she wanted to, how she wanted to be dressed, after she passed. And, I mean, it was so crazy that my sisters and I were like, okay, but it was such a gift because when it came down to it, and especially the way my parents died, 19 days apart, there was no discussion. Every little single detail was taken care of. And, that was actually a really wonderful gift. But at first it was kind of hard to wrap my head around, oh, that big, beautiful notebook is the death book. But like I said, it made things so easy for us. There was no question about anything.
When we went to visit the priest, I was raised Roman Catholic. My older brother said to Father Gramata, I don't know about, a funeral mass, so tell us what to do. And I said, Michael, this is what Dad wants. Dad wants a high mass. He wants my husband, who has a beautiful tenor voice, to sing. He wants the Ave Maria, the Lord's Prayer, and Amazing Grace. He does not want people to stand up in the middle of the service and talk about him, because if they didn't say it to his face, then they damn well better not say it at the funeral. That's my dad. So all of that was done.
Right.
My father had his entire funeral paid for. He made my brother the executive director, and all that stuff was settled. So we could walk into and not fret. We could walk into and honor and be with people and laugh when they told stories about Dad. We could do all of that because it was all spoken about. But I think the first chapter in my book is the elephant in the room. Because talking about death and dying is the elephant in the room. If you can imagine one being in a room Everybody's going to see it, but nobody's going to acknowledge that it's there.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that there is about death and dying. We know it's going to happen,
Mhm.
but we resist. And interestingly enough, beta readers, all right, these are people who read your book to give you a sense of what you've done and what you haven't done. One of them got back to me and she said, my parents have been trying to have these conversations with me for years, and I've always shut them down.
Mhm.
And she said, I won't do that anymore.
Mhm.
And she ordered the 5 wishes, not only for her parents, but for herself and her own family.
Mhm.
And then the second story is an elderly gentleman in Canada read it. And he and I talked on the phone, and he said, I didn't know that you did these things.
Mhm.
It's purely of lack of knowledge.
Mhm.
And once he got a hold of the 5 wishes, he did them.
Mhm.
And he said to his 2 daughters, for my birthday, I want to talk about it over Zoom. And that's what they did. And he said, this is what I want. This is what I want. This is what I don't want. This is what I want. And it came to burial, and he wanted to be cremated.
Mhm.
So his daughter said, well, gee, Dad, what do you want us to do with the ashes? Well, I don't care. Just don't put them over the bridge. And their response was, wouldn't you like them scattered at the farm? He
Mhm.
grew up in a 1-room farmhouse out on the prairies of Canada.
Wow.
And he said, oh, that's a lot of work. You don't need to do that. Well, what if we'd like to do that? Would you really? He changed it. He changed his 5 wishes so
Wow.
that when the time comes, that's what will happen.
Mhm.
But the best story was one of the women in my writers group. And she had been acutely ill for 10 years, and surgery after surgery after surgery, and disability and all that kind of stuff. And when she read it, she said, I'm going to order the 5 wishes.
Mhm.
We received word that she'd chosen hospice,
Mm.
but that she wanted to talk to us. So her husband set up 15-minute Zoom calls. When I talked to her, she just kept going on and on about the 5 wishes and how
Wow.
grateful she was, and how she and her family had had these long discussions, and that she was ready and they were ready to let her go.
Mm.
So that's the second book.
Mhm. Wow, that's really powerful, and another really important message to share with the listeners. Make sure let's just put it this way, get your ducks in a row. I'm definitely going to get the 5 wishes, because the one thing I want to make sure more than anything else, this is so silly, but as a dog lover, you would appreciate it, is I want to make sure that, I want to be cremated, and I want my ashes. And, with my husband and my dogs, I want us all to be together in the same place. Put us in a crate, put us in a bucket. I don't care. But I just want to make sure, I've got like 14 little boxes of remains down here with me in the girl cave with all the dogs that we rescued over the years. So I just want to make sure that we all go together.
Uh-huh.
So I see the 5 wishes in my future.
Yes. And a friend of mine did the 5 wishes, and she called me and she said, this is a question, but what would my family want? And I said, no.
Right.
I said, this is a time when you have to think about yourself. What do you want? How do you want it to be? And in the end, she discussed it with her daughter. And she said it was one of the most intimate, loving conversations that they had ever had. So again, the joy that I feel knowing that my dad went, and here's how he wanted to go: feet first out of his own home.
Mm-hmm.
That meant on a gurney, out the door.
Mm-hmm.
We used to laugh. We used to laugh when you bring that up. So the EMTs are working on him, and I know that's what they need to do, but I called the hospital and I said, you've got a DNR on his chart.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure it's at the emergency room when they bring him in.
Mm-hmm.
The lovely doctor from the emergency room called the EMTs and said, you can stop working on him.
Oh.
So I was laying down beside him, my arm over his chest.
Mm-hmm.
I told him that I loved him. I told him that I would miss him. I told him that I knew that he was going to be with mom, which is what he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did what was the glue in our family, the Lord's Prayer.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord's Prayer. So the EMTs put him on a gurney. I go get my coat and stuff. I'm going out the door. And they have the gurney parked behind the ambulance, and the ambulance doors are open. And the snow is coming down an
Oh.
inch an hour. And the light radiating on my father's face, there's this soft, sweet smile.
Oh.
And I went, and the EMTs looked at me, and I said, you just gave him what he wanted. He
Yeah.
wanted to go feet first out of his own home.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad's picture's right here beside me. I can look over at him right now with my mom. I don't feel the same thing about losing them.
Mm-hmm.
I feel very differently. My mom died alone in an antiseptic hospital,
Oh.
scared to death because she was in the beginning stages of dementia and she knew it.
Mm-hmm.
So that compared to my father,
Mm-hmm.
there's no comparison.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, Yvonne, this has been an amazing conversation. What a story. I am so glad that you shared this with us today. And tell the audience how they can find you. Where can they connect with you or buy your books?
Well, if you Google the name Yvonne Caputo,
Mm-hmm.
you'll find lots of things about me.
Yes, you will.
You can purchase a book. I like to push independent bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go into an independent bookstore, just say you want them to order it for you.
Mm-hmm.
You can certainly find it online at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. My email is fairly simple. It's Yvonne, Yvonne, author, AUTHOR, 4 @gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone would want to reach out to me, because I do have books on hand and would like to order one for a signature, that's a possibility as well.
Okay, wonderful. And before we wrap up, or before we sign off, do you have one final message for the audience, pearl of wisdom, golden nugget, whatever you want to leave them with?
When I was a teacher and I was working with adolescents, one of them stopped me in the hall between classes. And she said to me, Miss Caputo, how do you get to do all of the things that you've done? And my response to her was, I'm just living my dream. I think we all need to just live our dreams.
Absolutely. Well, Yvonne, thank you so much for being on the show. I've really appreciated it. This has been fabulous. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Yep, it was great from my end as well.
And everybody, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Make sure you share this episode with everyone you know, and go to Yvonne's website. She does have a really beautiful website. Get her book, share your stories, and remember to live your dream. Is there anything else?
And I would ask, as a way to end, please leave a review for the books. And Cheryl will let you know how absolutely important that is.
Reviews are really important. They could make or break an author. And, people will always say, oh, sure, of course, I'll leave a review, and they forget. So please don't forget. So while you're writing a review for the books for Yvonne, make sure you leave a review for the FemiNinja Project as well. And do remember to share your stories, live your dream. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.